This is Truth and Other Lies, episode 1938.1, Argumentum, Aureus, Fallacious.
38.1, huh? Well, Mark, speaking of numbers,
we've adopted star dates from Star Trek.
That's good. We just had a production meeting and we didn't cover this. Thank you. Mark, where were we? By 1971, Mark, the United States had abandoned the gold standard. The calamities attributed to this action ranged from the vortexian national debt to soybeans being called edamame. Can a conclusive argument, Mr. Jacobin, be made for or against the gold standard to lay the issue in its final, albeit gilded resting place here in the United States of America? Also coming up on today's program, you can text us at 830-JACOBIN. That's 830-JACOBIN. You can text us anytime, and if it's worthy, we'll play it on the air. Join us at jacobinbrothers.com. It's our revamped website. That's jacobinbrothers.com for all the latest episodes. You can also register to get the back catalog and Mark's musings and Mark's blog. Mark Jacobin, before we get into the titillating, exciting, eye-popping, caffeine-filled world of gold, I hear Mr. Snowden has some more legal troubles.
Yes, in fact, Cousin Eddie has been recalled from the White House to be a part of Edward Snowden's legal team because he's being sued by the Department of Justice for violating his non-disclosure agreement with the United States.
Word out of the Politburo, or defunct Politburo over there in the Kremlin, is that old Uncle Vlad likes Cousin Eddie. Much like he likes his... Never mind.
Much like he likes harboring American spies.
And radiating the hell out of journalists and influence American elections, allegedly.
I don't know exactly how you would classify Edward Snowden from the adversarial perspective. A traitor, I guess, is what he would be seen as by the United States since he gave up all their goods.
Democratic candidate for president and former Vice President Joseph Biden concurred with then Secretary of State and former Senator from Massachusetts John Kerry that Mr. Snowden was indeed a treasonist and should be hung from a naval yardarm. I think they'd all change their tune now for politically expedient reasons. I think the case of Edward Snowden is extraordinarily intricate. I mean, on his face, he's a traitor. But on the other hand, I'm extraordinarily happy that he leaked all this stuff out. It doesn't appear that he put American lives or secret missions.
The bar for treason is always very high. You have to lend aid and comfort to the enemy. By leaking all of the NSA secrets, maybe that did make the enemy more comfortable, but I've always questioned why Edward Snowden doesn't qualify for the whistleblower rule.
Well, exactly, which was put in place. Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers, Elder Ellsberg was charged. He was never tried due to the Nixon administration shenanigans. When you say aid and comfort to the enemy, Mark, I think an overarching question that spans the entire political spectrum of the 330 Americans that pay attention to this stuff. Well, we have 330 million people in the country. Maybe 20 people pay attention to this stuff. Who is the enemy? Is the NSA the enemy of, say, China, Iran, ISIS, Vladimir Putin, or is the NSA the enemy of personal individual liberties and freedoms for the American population? And I think Edward Snowden took the position that the NSA, albeit in the powers that be, are the enemy of the American people, not just our adversaries overseas. I think that's the position he took.
Well, I think it's actually the inverse. If what Edward Snowden did benefited the American people and he's guilty of treason, then that means the NSA considers the American people the enemy. And their actions and attitude support that position.
Don't worry, they're not listening. They're not going to hear that. Aid and comfort to who? I mean, the only people that truly benefited from what Snowden did was interested people here in America. I doubt that our adversaries overseas in any way culled any information that helped them advance on us militarily, strategically, in the financial markets in any way. I'm not entirely sure because there's 67,000 trillion pages of documents out there, but nothing. He didn't release the nuclear codes, if you will. Now, at the same point, he did break several federal laws. I would like to see him brought back to America and tried for that, and very most likely found guilty by a jury who would vacate the evidence and give him leniency. Like in the end, it's got to be resolved. Oh, but why are they suing him?
Breaking his NDA because he is now attempting to publish a book. So Releasing several thousand pages of sensitive material apparently isn't breaching the NDA. When you try to profit from the release of that information, that's when the DOJ gets involved and says, oh, no, you can't do that.
We've got an indictment over here if you ever come back to America, or if we can ever get our hands on you, that it's a 6,000-page indictment, okay? But we're just going to sit on that. But if you want to write a book about your experiences, we're going to sue you in civil court. That's what they're suing them in civil court.
Right. You're right.
Well, that's what Stormy Daniels did to the president. Didn't that NDA, isn't that what got Michael Cohen? Well, Michael Cohen was a gangster, I guess, a wannabe gangster. But so the only thing that they can do to Edward Snowden is sue him.
That's it. That's as far as the long arm of the law can reach. Let's take a break and come back with Argumentum, Aureus, Fallacious. Find your favorite Jacobin Brothers merchandise at shop.jacobinbrothers.com. T-shirts, hats, and beverage conveyances all branded with your favorite Jacobin Brothers logo. You'll be shocked by how much smarter you sound debating your friends while wearing official Jacobin Brothers apparel. Also find merchandise for truth and other lies. Shop.jacobinbrothers.com.
Welcome into Truth and Other Lies. I am James Jacobin along with my older brother, Mark. Mark, today's topic, the gold standard. I'm not going to even attempt to say that whatever milkshake Greek words you put together there to title the show today. Mark, the gold standard has been subject, again, huge fodder out there for people who are distrustful of government. Only this time the fodder leans to the right side of the political spectrum. Your conservatives, your Tea Party members, your libertarians have questioned why in 1971 Richard Nixon completely removed us from the gold standard, seemingly taken us toward a one world government, new world order run by the Illuminati bankers and the behind the scene hands of shadowy figures that run the world's financial markets. So my question for you, Mark, being that finance, especially world finance, is so complicated, why are we doing a show about the gold standard?
Because we're doing the show and we're going to settle this issue once and for all.
Yes, but why are we, the Jacobin brothers, doing a show about international finance?
Because all of the overeducated eggheads who sit up there with the chalkboards and their slide rules trying to tell us all the difficulties of economics have really missed the point.
Yeah, well, you're talking about the hand-wringing emeritus, whatever, from this university or that university that come down on one of two economic historical sides, that the gold standard was the greatest thing ever, and I mean ever, even better than sliced bread, okay? Or the gold standard had been holding the world back for the last 6,000 years. And there doesn't seem to be this question ever being answered. And I'm going to say it pretty loudly. What the hell is the gold standard?
We're not even on a gold standard, so why would we talk about it?
I know we haven't been on a gold standard since everyone listening was born, I don't think. With all due respect to Uncle Paul, he was born a little bit before 71, I think. But the fact is this. You hear the word gold standard popped out, mainly in commercials for gold. But, God, I love capitalism. I do. But mainly it's popped out there as some sort of pejorative or like talking point or bullet point or some sort of gotcha moment in politics every few years, even every few weeks. The gold standard, the Federal Reserve, overnight banking rates, the gold standard. But what is the gold standard? And check this out. Why is it relevant to American life today when for more than a generation and a half, we haven't been on, quote unquote, the gold standard?
The reason it's relevant is because there is a contingent of people out there who think that we should be and blame many of our financial woes on the fact that we're not on the gold standard. It's in the consciousness because people like to point to that and say, that's why we have problems. Just like they like to point to a politician and say, well, that politician is the reason we have all of our problems. If that politician went away, life would be great.
The old backup quarterback syndrome.
Right.
Your starting quarterback's no good. That guy sitting over on the bench must be better.
And so they benched Eli Manning and they brought out the other guy.
Davy Jones.
That's the backup quarterback syndrome. It could also be called the gold standard syndrome if you're in economic circles.
Yeah, and I think the bankers and the academia intelligentsia talk about these things in the type of language that it's not just that it's boring, it's bang your head against the wall boring, but also the terminology, the words used internally in the finance world are hard to follow. So, Mark, what you're going to do here today, the next few minutes, is break it down for the average person, someone like me who didn't go to, the same school that Alan Greenspan went to. What's the gold standard?
The gold standard is using gold as money. That's it, using gold as money. Gold has been used as a currency since at least 560 BCE, when the Lydians learned how to separate gold from silver and other trace minerals in the alloy known as electrum. And James, you're going to tell us who the Lydians are, right?
Can we find them in Asia Minor?
Yes, we can. Present-day Turkey. Thank you. You get the gold star.
Pretty early in the morning here, I think.
We should have a segment called Stump James Jacobin.
Yeah, my girlfriend would love to call in on that one.
A nation's wealth has historically been linked to how much gold they can mine or plunder. This was one motivating factor in the great navigations of the Renaissance. We always hear about the spices, but let's face it, gold is a lot better than pepper, right? Fast forward to the 19th century, and America has adopted what we refer to as a gold standard. Now, there are many ways you can define a gold standard, but we're going to use the term as it was implemented by the Americans between 1879 and 1971, which they themselves, those methods, did not conform to a single immutable methodology. So when we say gold standard, we're talking about all the ways that the Americans correlated gold to their currency during that 100-year time span or so.
Yeah, and they included other precious metals as items of value, such as silver.
Yes, silver has always been a fallback currency for many nations up until we adopted the final version of what we'd call the gold standard, or the codified version. In 1879, silver was a large part of our currency mix.
So you could almost say, like, Mark, for instance, the British pound, right? The British pound, well before the gold standard came along, the British pound was based on a metric pound of silver. Obviously, that's gone away now. So basically, this could almost be called the precious metal standard. Like when you take something that you mine out of the ground that's relatively rare, that's durable, that's pliable, right? That's portable, that can be, that becomes the currency of the day.
Right.
Is that more or less? Okay.
Right. Although it's just the pound sterling, there's no metric pound.
Well, what am I, British?
The metric system didn't kill the Brits until the 1970s. In fact, because they adopted the metric system, they now have to deal with Brexit. That's how that works.
I don't know. I never went into Burger King when I was in Amsterdam.
Okay. Prior to 1879, gold was exchanged at free market rates. They would strike some gold coins, but gold coins have a face value, but they also have an intrinsic value, how much people think that metal is worth. And so you have a problem in that people will value that coin according to what they want it to be worth as opposed to what's on face value. That's one of the issues that occurs with it. So by 1879, the U.S. government said gold will be converted at $20.67 per ounce, $20.67. So that's when they fixed the price of gold, meaning made it permanent.
Okay, I'm going to interject here. That means 20 treasury notes or $20 bills per 1 ounce of gold. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so that would be known as an exchange rate or the backing rate of gold. If you walked into a bank and you gave them 20 US dollar bills, known as treasury notes to this day, they'd give you a piece of gold worth $20, an ounce of gold, correct?
Right. Well, they're not treasury notes anymore. They're Federal Reserve notes, but that's a different story.
All right, Mark, I'm trying to keep up here, man. You're nitpicking.
You got to keep the details straight, man.
Let's just talk about football.
Football.
Antonio Brown's in the news.
Okay. Every time I say Eli Manning, that means gold. Every time I say Davy Jones, that means silver.
There we go. Okay, so Mark, so just so we're all keeping up with the conversation, is 20-to-1 exchange rate, $20 bills, treasury notes, reserve notes, to 1 ounce.
Fast forward 140 years. The price of gold, as of last night when I looked it up, was $1,504.95 per ounce, which means that gold is worth about the American dollar is worth about 1.4% of what it was back then if we were to revert to the gold standard.
Yeah, so I'd have to walk in there with, to carry the one, a wheelbarrow full of money to get an ounce of gold out of the bank. But we're not on the gold standard, so they're not going to give me one anyway.
Right.
This is the point of the show. There is no gold standard.
What we haven't gotten to yet is that while the U.S. was on the gold standard, you could walk in with a greenback, give them $20.67, and they would give you an ounce of gold. They were required to give you that ounce of gold. That exchange, that backing of the dollar by gold, has created over the years as many problems as it has been purported to solve, because people assign any value to those paper notes, and they felt that any time the U.S. economy was in trouble, they had to run to the bank, exchange that paper for real money, which was gold.
And that would be known what's called a run on a bank, where people run to the bank to get the money. And there was two times this happened, in 1890 and also 1929.
And we'll come back and talk more about running the bank.
830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it is a great idea. Call or text 830 Jacobin anytime. If we like what you have to say, we'll discuss your comments on the air. If we don't like what you have to say, you'll hear about that too. 830 Jacobin. It's not a law, but it should be.
Truth and Other Lies, episode 38.1. Mark, what's the title of the show today, please, sir?
Argumentum, Aureus, Fallacious.
Now, I normally repetitively repeat the title of the show unless you do something like this. So we've been discussing the gold standard. What its purpose is, was there calamities, hyperinflation, runs on banks, Illuminati? Were these the reasons that we abandoned the gold standard, or was the gold standard had it just become antiquated? But before we can get into a more thorough discussion on the results of the abandonment of the gold standard, I think bringing people up to speed on what the gold standard actually is and what it meant to the American economy is very fruitful. So,
in the end, we abandoned the gold standard for the most banal reason imaginable. There's no conspiracy. There's no mystery. There are no men and women standing around in hooded cloaks.
But before you get,
we're not going to cover that. We're not going to cover that yet. That'll come up next when we talk about Nixon again. Strangely, all roads lead to JFK or Nixon.
Because we all know Nixon killed JFK, so it's compatible.
But gold is part and parcel to what we call American monetary policy. And one way to characterize the history of that monetary policy is the banks trying to swindle their customers and the government doing everything in its limited power to protect people from the banks until the banks finally swindled the government. But that's a story for another day.
Mark, do I hear you, Mark Jacobin, defending big government right there? That regulating banks and bankers is good for the American people? That's rare, sir.
No. What you heard me saying was that limited government was no match for the banks.
So we had to have a bigger one.
So we had to have a bigger one. Well, so the banks took over the government and made a bigger government. But like I said, we'll cover that in another decade.
And then the government became too big to fail.
The government became too big to fail. That's correct. So we adopted the gold standard in 1879. Now, there are a lot of pros and cons that go along with the gold standard, but what we want to move to now is the time period from about 1930 to 1971, when all of the interesting things happened in the history of the gold standard. And James, I believe you have something to say about that.
Well, there's a few things to say. And first of all, Mark, thanks for educating me on the gold standard. It's fascinating. Tomorrow we can cover copper and rubies. Okay, in all seriousness, the myth of the gold standard is, yes, gold has been used for 5,000 to 6,000 years, for as long as we've got recorded writings of people bartering, doing transactions, commerce. Any society, for the most part, that thrived. The Romans, Mark, the Romans used to pay their soldiers in gold coins. And you know how they got off the gold standard, Mark? Well, the Romans didn't have enough gold coins to pay all the Roman soldiers because they were extended too far from their homeland borders. So they started cutting the coins in half and paying the Roman soldiers and more or less just telling them it's worth the same thing.
So that's where a pay cut comes from, a literal cut in your pay.
That would make sense. I don't know that for sure, but that would make sense. So eventually the Roman soldiers just stopped fighting. So I bring that up just as an example of this gold standard debate. Or how to value money. has been going on and on for a long time.
They should have called it quantitative easing, and then people would have believed them.
Quantitative easing of the intrinsic financial markets. I'm sure the Roman soldiers would have understood that. Okay, so we're going to go back to a little bit before 1931. Is first of all, the big misconception out there among the segment, probably the more conservative segment of the American population, is that we were always on the gold standard, that we always had a central bank. And the fact of the matter is the answer to that is no. From 1836, when Andrew Jackson killed the central bank, up until about 1913, when the Federal Reserve came into play, there was no central bank. And the reason this is relevant, Mark, is that a central bank's primary job is to more or less print money, issue gold, issue valuations for the currency or the monetary value of whatever the thing is that the people in that country are going to be bartering with. We did not have one for the longest time, and the country thrived. The Industrial Revolution, this, that, and the other thing. Now, moving up to before 1930, the rest of the world had central banks and was on the gold standard. We joined the party in 1879, as you educated us on, to be a part of the gold standard. There's one thing that usually always moves countries away from the gold standard, Mark. Do you know what that is?
The Illuminati.
Aha, we stumped Mark Jacobin. It's war. It's war. Before World War I, the primary reason, other than the fact that the world was about to fight a war for uber ridiculous reasons, right, was the war couldn't last that long because no one had the money for it. No one had the money to outlay the treasure to send their soldiers all over Central and Western Europe to fight for years on end. So what happened was numerous countries, including England, temporarily suspended the gold standard so they could do what? Ding, 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 print more money. Because if you're on the gold standard, you cannot print more money, or you at least can't print it beyond what you've already stated the exchange rate for your gold to paper currency is. Is that making sense?
Sure.
Okay, so the reason why after World War I, the entire world was, except for us, of course, worked out pretty well for us, is that the hyperinflation kicked in because of all this money that was printed that was still in circulation. It was still in circulation, so the countries then moved back to the gold standard, but you've got way more money out there than the gold standard can possibly support. That's what's called hyperinflation. So getting back to America, 1930s come along. Now, I just said that mainly war causes people to get off the gold standard. The one aberration to that was the United States of America. In the run-up to the Great Depression, as the manufacturing jobs started to go away, as all these other things happened with the financial crash on Wall Street in 1929, it became apparent that there wasn't going to be enough gold when the run on the banks came. And the run on the banks came from 1929 to 1933. And when FDR, President Franklin Roosevelt, took office in March of 73, the very first thing he did is declared a national banking holiday and closed all the banks so he could come up with a plan. And the plan was this. Here's what we're going to do. We're not going to come off the gold standard, but what we're going to do is say, hey, the banks don't have to have on hand the amount of gold, that 20-to-1 exchange rate we're talking about. If someone comes in with $20, the banks are no longer legally required to have that gold in the bank to give the customers because there just wouldn't be enough gold to do it. And what happened was that gave the public confidence that their money had value because the president had just said, look, your money is going to be worth the same as gold. Just trust me. And even though it wasn't worth the same as gold, they trusted him. And there's a lot more to it, but in the end, they had trust and faith in Mr. Roosevelt. Now, the other thing he did at the exact same time.
Well, they would have had to because Mr. Roosevelt did a lot of things that he couldn't get away with today or even on any legal footing if people had challenged him.
Well, he didn't get away with a lot of it back then. But the other thing that happened at the same time. Now, if Mark, more or less here's what he did, and this is going to scare the hell out of the conservatives, and this is also exactly why conservatives are always pining for the good old days of the gold standard, right? Is because there's no other vocabulary word to say this. Franklin Roosevelt nationalized gold. When in any country, the government takes the product, says you can't possess it, you can't own it, you can't profit on it, you can't trade it, and they take it and they put it somewhere. That's called nationalization. Okay, this is usually the first step in socialist overthrows or in economic corrections in countries. This is why conservatives hate this. Right? Here's how Roosevelt did it. He did it in a two-step process. He said, look, everybody, your paper money is going to be more or less worth as much as gold. The next day, he made it illegal to possess gold as a private citizen. I know. Yeah, good stuff. It's true. Now, and in doing that, he said, okay, we, the U.S. government, are going to buy that gold back from you, private citizen, in the exchange rate of the day. So in the end, he did make good on the promise to say, look, this paper is just as good as your gold. I'm giving you the exchange rate. So he takes all the gold. And the second part of nationalization is always what? You take it out of the public and you store it in one place. Mark, do you know where that gold is or where it should be?
It's in an underground vault in Moscow.
Is that where they moved Fort Knox to? So,
yeah. Well, according to one conspiracy theory, it was all moved out of Fort Knox and shipped to Russia.
Right. Now, so President Roosevelt nationalized gold. It's a dirty little secret that Americans don't like to talk about because we don't like to look at ourselves as being socialistic or have socialism or any sort of ism in any way except capitalism. And we nationalized gold. Now, the one thing I forgot to point out earlier, we didn't just nationalize gold because of the American people making runs on banks. The other thing that was happening was the other countries in the Great Depression had already gone off the gold standard, and we had not. So that meant that other countries like France, I believe, from 1929 to 1933, cashed in $18 billion worth of treasury notes and took that physical gold out of America. They came and cashed it into the tune of $18 billion worth of gold, put it on ships, and took it home. FDR looked at this and said, if this keeps up, there's going to be no gold left. So he nationalized it. So it doesn't look to me, looking back on it, to be an evil conspiracy. We were faced with economic collapse. Venezuelan, Greece, Argentinian, to name modern ones, collapse. Roosevelt took the steps he thought he had to take, and it turned out to be pretty successful.
Let's take a break and come back and talk more about the gold standard. BarryParham.com. This episode is sponsored by the award-winning humorist Barry Parham. He writes a weekly humor column for BarryParham.com and has published 9 volumes of humor collections, the latest of which is Winding Down Civilization. All of the books are available at Amazon.com in paperback or Kindle format. BarryParham.com.
My medium is commentary.
The man survived, but he now owns several unnecessary left shoes.
Thank you. Good night.
Welcome back into Truth and Other Lies. I am James Jacobin, as always, along with my other brother, Mark Jacobin. This is our live bi-coastal podcast, Truth and Other Lies. Mark, what is that in Latin?
Slow it down a little bit.
Truth and Other Lies. Mark, today's show, the gold standard. So more or less, part one of getting off the gold standard was what Roosevelt did in the 30s. Everything pretty much remains the status quo up until 1971. A little-known, non-controversial figure by the name of Richard Nixon is president. And Nixon, after meeting with his economic cabinet advisors in 1971, comes back from Camp David and announces that he's going to temporarily remove us completely from the gold standard. Completely from the gold standard. Now, this had worldwide effects for 2 reasons. Because in the interim, from the early 30s to 1971, the Second World War happened. And after the Second World War happened, well, America was the bank of the world, more or less. So the rest of the countries in the world were on the gold standard, but here was the difference. Watch this, Mark. A lot of people don't know this. The American dollar, the value of the American dollar was tied to gold. The value of everyone else's currency was tied to the American dollar. This is a huge distinction. So our money here in America tied to physical gold. The rest of the world tied to the value of the dollar.
And it's very interesting when you read different interpretations of the Bretton Woods Agreement, which is where that originated, where a lot of people will say countries chose to peg their currency to the American dollar. Yeah, they chose because America was standing there with a virtual gun to their head.
They said, oh, well, Belgium, you owe us $67 trillion for those tanks we gave you to fight off the Nazis. You can either pay us back or just tie your currency to the dollar. Okay, good. Look, they voluntarily did it, Mark.
Wow, a little trick we picked up from Mr. Joseph Stalin.
Hello, Netherlands. You guys are starving to death after the Nazi occupation there for 4 or 5 years. Hey, tell you what, we'll give you some rice and soybeans if you tie the. Anyways, so more or less, we're painting the picture here that America really took over the world's. We took over for London. New York City took over for London as being the financial center of the world after World War II. We tied the rest of the world's currency to the value of the dollar. We tied our dollar to the gold. And in 1971, when Richard Nixon was looking at exploding populations and exploding inflation around the world, he made a highly controversial decision at the time. And he said at the time, and all his advisors assumed at the time, because that's what the meeting was about, that it would just be a temporary going off the gold standard, much like England did prior to World War I, and they were off the gold standards until 1925. So by that time frame, we would have been back on the gold standard by about 1980, 81. It's now 2019, and we're not back on the gold standard. The gold standard is gone. Now, Mark, here's the $1 million question, or the million ruble question, or Deutschmark, or whatever. Why did Richard Nixon pull us off the gold standard?
Because he was an evil, evil president and he wanted to mess with conservatives.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to Truth, There Lies, Mark.
The answer is much more simple than that, James. What is it?
There wasn't enough gold anymore.
No. We ran out of gold?
We had printed too much money. The Federal Reserve had issued, remember the central bank conversation from earlier in the program, Mark?
Yep.
The central bank, with no one disciplining them, had printed too much money over a period of time. There was too much money in circulation, to the point where even today, 70% of every piece of currency in the world is in a U.S. dollar bill, one way or another. Nixon said this can't sustain itself. Now, the reason it worked, because if we take ourselves off the gold standard, the first thing that should happen is this: run on banks. Oh, wait, there's no gold there anyway. Hyperinflation. Think Venezuela, because no one would honor the American dollar. So here's what happens. The Nixon people go around and tell everybody, look, we're getting off the gold standard. You should too. Now, had the rest of the world said no, America would have found itself in almost near financial collapse. The reason everyone agreed to let America just change the rules of the game for everyone is this: they were uncertain of what would happen to their own economies, being that they tied their currency to the American dollar.
We're all going down together, folks.
So more or less, my humble James Jacobin opinion, the American government in the form of the Nixon administration more or less blackmailed the world, held them hostage. They're like, yeah, sure, we're going to do what we want. You can come along or not. Yeah. But he did it for a very good reason. There was no longer enough gold in Fort Knox, literally, to even come close to the exchange rate.
By one count, there was about $14.5 billion worth of gold in Fort Knox. There were $45 billion worth of American notes floating around the world, 3 times the amount of gold in Fort Knox. If there had been a run on the American banks, we would have been. We were technically bankrupt at that point in time. We were upside down.
Well, we've been upside down the other since, Mark, and that's going to lead us into the next part of the program about the gold standard. Is now, since there's nothing backing, quote unquote backing, there's no gold anywhere to back the dollar bill. There's no gold anywhere to back the pound or whatever else you want to talk about. Is the entire house of cards is just based on debt and borrowing money and trading pieces of paper that have no value, but they only have value because we say they have value. We acknowledge that they have value.
Right, and this brings us up to the point of if the world is still working, even though people haven't been on the gold standard for 50 years, why is it still working? Does it mean that we've found something as good or better than gold? Or does it mean that gold was never as good as we thought it was in terms of the premises that we assigned to the economic models that gold should support?
Well, let's be fair here, Mark. One thing that the conservatives who clamor at the ending of the gold standard is this very basic fact. We were only on the gold standard in its purest form for about 50 years. We've now been off the gold standard completely for less than 50 years. We have the greatest economy in the history of recognized planet Earth.
Well, and you could make the argument that we weren't even on it for that long. Well, no, you're right. You're right. On the gold standard for 50 years until they went back to fractional reserve banking, which is you can lend more money than what you have actually in the bank.
Right.
And every time things got tough, we relaxed the gold standard, right? When you go to war, you relax the gold standard so you can print more money. So the reality is that the gold standard only worked when there wasn't something challenging it. Because as soon as something challenged the gold standard, we modified it according to those circumstances.
Yeah, which isn't a bad thing. I think more than 100 years ago, Mark, whenever we printed more money, to make that worth it, to keep inflation down, you could buy 100-year gold bonds. Right.
But that's my point, is that the gold standard wasn't the reason that the economy was stable. The reason the economy was stable is that the powers that be, the central bank, understood monetary policy, inflationary principles, and the bottom line that the amount of currency in circulation has to reflect the value generated by the economy, and you can't do that with a shiny rock that is only available if you dig it out of the ground.
Ladies and gentlemen, what Mark Jacoben is trying to say that inflation is the killer of every economy in the history of the world. And this is why getting off the gold standard, it appears, doesn't matter, because the same problem existed on the gold standard as off, and that's inflation. Period.
Well, inflation is one problem, but the point I'm getting to is that the amount of currency in circulation has to match the value being created by the economy. Otherwise, you end up doing what the Romans do. If you only have 100 pieces of gold, and yet you have 10 more factories today than you had last year, then you have to cut the pieces of gold in half to represent the value generated by the economy.
Right. So what you're specifically talking straight into is the gold standard, meaning that if you're on the gold standard, then you've got to have just as much gold as you have paper currency, more or less.
Well, you can't create more gold out of thin air, okay? If you're digging up silver out of the ground and you're creating jewelry with it and selling it, and you're accepting gold coins for that silver, by virtue of the fact that you've dug that silver out of the ground and refined it and made it available for purchase as a good, you've added value to the economy. Now, when you add value using a physical form, and you're going to use a fiat currency like a dollar bill, the physical value you've added to the economy must match the value represented by your fiat currency or any currency. You can't magically create more gold to represent the value that's being generated by the economy. That's why every time the gold standard ran up against its very rigid boundaries, they simply relaxed it.
Yeah, and it leads to a temporary, almost false burst in the economy, because you can do what? Print more money. The banks can then loan more money, and then you can buy more goods to be paid back at a later date. And it just keeps going on like that.
Now, there is a fair argument to be made that a $22 trillion debt is a direct or very significant consequence of abandoning the gold standard. But governments have never let good fiscal responsibility prevent them from making bad decisions regardless of their monetary model.
Yeah, Mark, it wasn't so long ago in the year of our Lord, the 1980s, where Ronald Wilson Reagan borrowed more money than in the history of the world combined, and everyone's hair caught on fire.
Right.
We had not even a $2 trillion debt not even 30 years ago. What is it, 22 trillion now?
$20 trillion in 30 years. Let's take a break and conclude Argumentum Aureus Fallacious. Find your favorite Jacoben Brothers merchandise at shop.jacobenbrothers.com. T-shirts, hats, and beverage conveyances all branded with your favorite Jacoben Brothers logo. You'll be shocked by how much smarter you sound debating your friends while wearing official Jacoben Brothers apparel. Also find merchandise for truth and other lies. Shop.jacobenbrothers.com.
Jacoben. It's not a law, but it is a great idea. Call or text 830-JACOBIN anytime. If we like what you have to say, we'll discuss your comments on the air. If we don't like what you have to say, you'll hear about that too. 830-JACOBIN. It's not a law, but it should be.
It should be a law, Mark. We should put the Jacobin Brothers merchandise on the gold standard.
Where's FDR when you need him?
Yeah, exactly. He's hanging out with Lucy Mercer at the Georgia Hot Springs. Anyways, Mark, the gold standard. I think we've done a pretty accurate job of kind of putting all the pieces on the board, what the gold standard is, what it isn't. However, there seems to be a lot of downsides to being on the gold standard that you don't generally hear in public information circles. What are some of the more downsides of the gold standard? Because obviously the upside is you live within your means. You have just as much money as it can be supported by the gold or the exchange rate of the gold that's buried in Fort Knox or wherever it's buried. But that's a
what we've established is that the gold standard wasn't as standard as people would have believed.
Right, because they were always manipulating it, but still calling it the gold standard. Even though we were on the gold standard, we were rarely on the gold standard.
Right, yeah. Ever since 1932 or 33, you couldn't go to the bank and get gold for your dollars. So we haven't been on the gold standard since then, even though people thought we were. When Nixon, quote, abandoned the gold standard in 71, he was simply acknowledging the reality that had been in place for 30 years, 40 years.
Yeah, maybe even longer. Because, well, I'll let you get to this other stuff before I go
now,
to the population.
What I want to do is take a look at, is it even a good idea to have gold as a currency? Now, what I've always heard is that gold has intrinsic value, and this piece of paper doesn't have intrinsic value. Well, if I'm cold, I can burn that piece of paper and keep warm. It's harder to burn gold. I can use it to roll it into a straw and use it for whatever people use dollar bill straws for. I can fill it up with something and smoke it. I mean, a dollar bill is actually has a lot of intrinsic value that a gold coin simply doesn't have. Gold, historically, has been good for two things: jewelry and teeth. When you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, jewelry doesn't appear anywhere on it. But there's this emotional connection that people, and especially Americans, have with gold because it's been part of American or human civilization for so long. We have this emotional attachment. We attribute more value to gold than is actually there. There are other minerals or metals that would make a lot more sense as a currency, something like copper or zinc, iron. Lithium would be an awesome currency because lithium is so valuable to postmodern society. It's very rare and it's very useful. I can make a battery with lithium. Copper. Copper is the foundation of industrial society. It transmits electricity. It's very malleable. It's used in a lot of alloys. All of these things have far more real practical value than gold ever has had. We just have this emotional sense that it has intrinsic value.
Well, and I think for a long time it possibly did because it was more rare than the others and it was especially more durable, meaning it wouldn't degrade over a period of time like some of these other ones. It's transportable. But I think you're right. It's only awesome because we've said it's awesome. But even if we still said it's awesome, Mark, there are far too many people on the planet. Mark, there's 8 billion people on the planet now?
7, 8, a lot, more than we can count.
Okay. And what we counted 6,000 years ago was less than 1 million. And within those million, a few tribes or civilizations used gold. Right? So probably
and when you really get down to it, gold is a shiny rock, right? How civilized are we if we're basing our entire civilization on trading shiny rocks?
But it does give one a sense of security. For instance, Mark, when we transition in the next decade or two from paper dollars to online dollars, because it's going to happen, right? I, James Jacobin, am most likely to be one of those people saying, hey, you took us off the fiat system onto this online stuff. I want to be able to hold my money because now I'm going to have to trust. See, the generation before, right, felt secure because they knew that their money was backed by gold somewhere. And when that gold went away, they're like, well, now I got to trust the government that this paper is worth anything. And here pretty soon, we're going to transition to the next fiat system or currency system, and we're not going to have paper dollars. And we're going to have to place more trust in the same two entities that have been screwing us for 250 years, bankers and the government.
Yes. Now,
So actually, I'm going to get back on the gold standard. I just scared the hell out of myself.
all of a sudden, it's looking pretty good. Now, a couple of things that people say that we need the gold standard for. It can prevent runaway debt, which is only in theory because gold never prevented any nation from incurring debt. And number two is that it inhibits fractional reserve banking. But as we've already covered, it only inhibits fractional reserve banking if you actually adhere to a strict gold standard, and which we only did for the 50 years that you mentioned. So it's not about the gold. It's not about the rocks. It's not about the method of exchange. It's about the entity that sets and manages monetary policy, how responsible they are, and how much, to your point, that you trust them.
Are we going to leave a cliffhanger here, Mark? Am I hearing black helicopters for the Federal Reserve?
And that brings in the Federal Reserve System.
I knew it. This is where you're going with this.
No. Not on this show anyway. The Federal Reserve System is America's central bank. But the Federal Reserve System is very much misunderstood by the American masses, to the point where I was told in school that the United States didn't have a central bank because of the misleading name, Federal Reserve. In American parlance, federal means the government of the United States. So the Federal Reserve must be a branch of the United States government, ergo no central bank. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a central bank, the Federal Reserve does a fair, not a great, but a fair job of doing its job, which is to manage the flow of currency, the amount of currency in circulation, to make sure that we don't have more money than we should have, and that the amount of money in circulation matches the value that's being created by the economy.
Yes, and it's a large job because the world economy is bigger than it's ever been. The American economy is bigger than it's ever been. And the debt is bigger than it's ever been. So it's a multi-pronged job.
Right. And the debt for now, we'll set that aside. We're going to eliminate that from this moment's discussion and just talk about what the Fed does for you and me. The Fed sets a target of limiting inflation to 2%, which in an ideal world, it means that the dollar that you have in your pocket today, if it's worth 100 pennies today, a year from now, it will be worth 98 pennies, or it will be able to buy 98% of what you could buy today. Now, we all live in the real world, and we know that for the last 20 years, the real purchasing power of the American dollar has declined substantially, because inflation is numbers, and an accountant can torture numbers to make them tell you whatever they want them to say. But as far as that goes, they pump money into the economy, they remove money from the economy. They do this through several different tools. One of them is setting the interest rate. One of them is creating environments where money is easy to get or harder to get. You control inflation by increasing interest rates to make money harder to get, to make money more scarce. Instead of gold coins, we have credit, and we manage credit by varying an interest rate. We decrease the amount of credit by making higher interest rates. We increase the amount of credit by making lower interest rates. This has the analog of putting more gold into the system or pulling gold out of the system. So this is how it works. And this, I think, is indicative that monetary policy isn't dependent upon a shiny rock. It's dependent upon understanding the principles of economics and closely managing the economics of any given entity.
I completely agree. I think that's a great comparison. Your credit card is your gold nugget. And I'd take it even one step further for people sitting around their kitchen table right now trying to figure this out. The entire economy, the entire federal, it all comes down to this: consumer confidence. How confident are you that your paycheck's going to clear, that your credit card's going to work, and that when you go to the store to buy your goods, that the money's accepted? Period. There's a lot of other complicated things behind it that the American public's not too aware of, especially if you don't live in New York City. But it really just comes down to consumer confidence.
I would love to say that I take half of my paycheck and stuff it under my mattress. But the fact of the matter is, I never see my hard currency. I have my little...
Wait a minute. You get paid for doing this show?
Yeah, don't you?
What? I thought you told me we're in the red. That's it.
I'm sorry, James. It seems like you were fired, but everyone forgot to tell you.
Yeah, just fix the glitch.
But the fact is that I have this little piece of plastic in my wallet, and that piece of plastic gives me access to all the goods and services that I need throughout the week and throughout the month. And it becomes incredibly inconvenient for me to go to the bank, get those dollar bills out of the bank, carry those dollar bills around, fumble around with this copper and zinc mix of coins that rattle around in my pocket. I am, unfortunately, a product of the post-gold standard economy, and I like it.
Well, Mark, this show has been eye-opening for me for several reasons. You have very subtly just tied yourself to the fate of the Federal Reserve Board. I don't know. You're losing credibility, man.
What I'm saying is that just like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, is that good intentions don't pave the road to hell. Convenience does.
Yeah, there's probably no better way to say it and no better place to end this program, Mark. Any final thoughts to wrap up the gold standard?
Take us out.
What's the name of the program? I just want to hear it one more time.
Argumentum, Aureus, Fallacious.
Yes, that means my brother and I were going to argue about the gold standard today. Now I'm going to argue about why he gets paid and I don't. But well, we hope you found this fun and entertaining. We found it fun and entertaining and informative as our journey through the American currency and monetary system took us here. I'm James. On behalf of my brother Mark, we're the Jacobin Brothers, and you've been listening to Truth and Other Lies.